I didn't know anything about Adam prior, to be honest. Don't know anything about him.
Good evening, everyone. Nyama, Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Gulyin, Gurnganyinu Bik Wenawap Darabandari, Nyawiyana Nyanga Bik Ban Ba Nyagu, Gagukan Nangit Bambuth Yellingbu Ba Gamaji. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people on whose land Darebin Council stands. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. We've got the planning meeting tonight and membership of this meeting is as listed on the agenda. We have apologies from Councillor Lawrence, Councillor Lesurf and Councillor Messina. Councillors, are there any conflicts of interest to disclose this evening? Thank you. That brings us to confirmation of the minutes of the previous Planning Committee meeting. That's moved by Councillor Newton and seconded by Councillor Greco. All those in favour? That motion is carried. So that now brings us to consideration of reports, and the first report at 5.1 is Amendment to the Development Plan POD/1/2008. Mr Wallace, or Mr Rudd.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. This item seeks a council approval to amend the development plan for Stage 3B and Stage 3C of the Bell Centre complex. There are two key changes proposed. The first is to provide temporary landscape works adjacent to the former nurses' building on the eastern side of the complex, and that includes changes also made to the bus bays and the circulation for drop-off. There's an image of these proposed works that are included in page 6 of the agenda. The second element involves the removal of student accommodation and the replacement with hotel accommodation. Again, these changes impact the former nurses' building. There's also important to note that those changes do not involve internal works. It's a paper change from one type of occupation to another. This will see the total hotel room offer increase from 559 up to 927. There's a supporting traffic assessment that's been undertaken, that's been supported by our internal traffic engineers, and it basically says that the 573 parking spaces there present are adequate to support that change. Just to finally sum up, just to clarify, this is an amendment to a development plan, so it's not necessarily a planning application. What it is it's a broad brush conceptual plan that guides the overall development of the site. So the recommendation before you is to support the amendment to the development plan as requested.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. We have someone representing the applicant here to speak this evening. Mr Ben McAuliffe, would you like to come up? Yes, please take a seat and you have 5 minutes to address the Planning Committee.
Good evening, councillors and those watching online. We thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to say that we support the Planning Officer's recommendation for approval of the amended Bell Centre Development Plan. We affirm that the amended development plan and associated minor works across the site seek to enhance the hotel patron experience while facilitating the transition of the landmark former Panch site from a budget student accommodation and hotel to Northern Melbourne's premier hotel, conference and events centre. Further to the Officer's report and recommendation for approval of the proposed amendment, we also note the following. The proposed works are minor in their nature, with the only external works relating to the provision of a large landscaped area as shown on screen and a small bus drop-off and pick-up area, which will improve the quality of the short-term accommodation provided across the site. The remaining components of the amendment are administrative. The proposed conversion of underutilised car parking for the purposes of the landscape treatment as shown and guest facilities is supported by the project traffic engineers Cardno as well as Council's Traffic Department, which was just touched on, These improvements act as a form of street beautification and enhance the presentation of the site while benefiting the hotel patrons. Moving to the change of use component from the student accommodation units and dwellings to hotel rooms. These will not require any further internal rearrangement of the rooms or load-bearing walls, nor will there be an increase in the total rooms operating across the site. The transitioning rooms will simply cease to operate as student accommodation units or dwellings with no material change. The amended development plan simplifies the existing convoluted development plan by improving its readability and navigation. This would enable any further minor changes in the future that are generally in accordance with the development plan to be addressed by way of permanent amendment or secondary consent. The amended development plan protects the approved ultimate development outcome for the site, with particular reference to the mixed-use building approved in 2014 that is still an active permit that is yet to be built. And this is identified as stage 3D within the amended development plan that we have prepared. And while there is a degree of economic uncertainty during this challenging period, the owner of the site seeks to facilitate short-term and ongoing employment opportunities within the local area. The proposed improvements to the site and the simplification of the overarching development plan demonstrates a confidence in commercial investment within Darebin and within the local economy. We once again thank you for this opportunity and affirm our support for Council's planning assessment of the proposal. And we look forward to strengthening the relationship between Council and the owner of the site so that the Bell City Complex can transition into Northern Melbourne's premier hotel, conference and events centre. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr McAuliffe. You may resume your seat. Councillors, there are no objectors listed to speak tonight, so I'll invite you to ask any questions of the officers that you might have before we move to debate. Councillor Gueco.
Do we need to stand or?
No.
Okay. Thanks, Mayor Rennie. Look, I just had a question just in regards to the change in use from student accommodation to hotel accommodation, and I just wanted to better understand whether that's within the envelope of the development plan that's associated with this particular application.
Mayor Rennie, the development plan at the moment is quite unusual. It's quite explicit about various accommodation types within the centre, and that's what the application before you is, to change that to a more general accommodation, or to allow the change from student accommodation to hotel accommodation. So it is quite unusual that a development plan will regulate a land use activity, because primarily they're focused on development outcomes and broad development outcomes. So the request before Council or the Planning Committee tonight is to allow the removal of student accommodation and the replacement with hotel accommodation. And the reason for that is the current development plan that's approved specifically requires those quantities of student accommodation.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions? No? Is there a motion? Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. Sorry, Chair, I should say. I'd like to move a motion that's different to the one listed in the officer's report. I believe that the officers should have a copy of it, but I can read it out for the purpose if you wish. So it's an alternative motion. The motion is that Council not support the amended development plan, POD/1/2006, with the grounds as follows. Point 1. The proposal does not comply with clause 21.04-4 of the Darebin Planning Scheme, which encourages affordable student housing near major educational institutions. Point 2. In this instance, student housing is to be removed from the proposal, which is contrary to Council's housing strategy, which seeks to encourage student housing in identified substantial and incremental change areas. Point 3, the wholesale removal of student... I'm just having to flip the page here. Student accommodation is not justified, taking into account the consideration guidelines of the Development Plan Overlay Schedule 5 and the provision of student housing on the originally approved development plan.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy, for that motion. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Newton. Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, obviously we find ourselves in an interesting situation with this amendment and obviously the current circumstances for what the Bell City facility is being used for, which I think came to us as a surprise in terms of what is allowable under current planning provisions. That's a separate matter to the grounds that we have before us here tonight, which is in fact very strong planning grounds for objecting to this proposal. In this case, Council has, and has for some time, had a clear view and a clear position, and as has, I believed, the applicant in this case, of a commitment to that student housing provision. The proposal here is actually to move away from that, which is a variation from Council's stated policy position, and certainly is a variation from where I think we believe and would hope that this site would actually serve a useful purpose in relation to providing that housing opportunity that is connected and supports educational aspirations. I would just say that it is quite a damning indictment that a hotel can be used as a detention facility, as has been advised, and that is a matter for obviously state authorities in relation to the provisions that are allowable under a planning scheme. I would hold concern as well that any change of use would provide for further use in that facility for detention. However, we need to stick in this case to clear planning grounds on the basis of considering any objection or refusal of this application. And on that basis, the grounds that we have before us, which are based on the removal of student accommodation, are very strong, they're very clear, and they should be considered, certainly by any other jurisdiction that may deal with this matter in the future. In relation to the Darebin housing strategy, and the clause there is listed, the aspiration is listed in point 2, it's very clear to us as a city that we have limited opportunities for dedicated student housing. Having been through the previous incarnations of the Bell City Development Plan, it is surprising to see this application come forward in this way, because it is a departure from what we understood to be a stated commitment at that site for the provision of that housing. That doesn't mean that it's always been smooth sailing, but in relation to that particular provision, I believe very strongly that the Planning Committee should refuse this particular application and stand by that commitment to student housing on that site. We do need to see also, obviously, a review and a reconsideration of what this particular planning provision allows for in relation to the detention, and I would say immoral detention of refugees in the way that we are well aware of, but that's a matter which we'll have to take up in another jurisdiction. So I'll end it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I would agree with everything that Councillor McCarthy has said, and all I want to note too is that it is unacceptable that dozens of men have been trapped in this hotel for over 6 months now while they are in limbo with Medivac. We have seen protests at this site, and I don't think that we should be supporting Bell City at this time.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there any further speakers? If not, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. The Planning Committee has resolved not to support the amended development plan. The applicant does have the ability to appeal this decision. Thank you. We'll move now to item 5.2 on the agenda.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and councillors. This is an application for the construction of 3 new double-storey dwellings on a corner site, the northeast corner of Elliott Street and Chevelle Street. Unit 1 will front Elliott Street, whilst Unit 2 and 3 will front Chevelle Street. In terms of the composition of the dwellings, Unit 1 is to have 4 bedrooms. 1 bedroom is on the ground floor, next to an open plan living area, whilst the first floor has 3 bedrooms. Unit 2, which is the central dwelling, has its living space on the ground floor and 3 bedrooms on the first floor. Unit 3 has its living space on the ground floor and 2 bedrooms and an open study nook on the first floor. Private open space is provided at ground level for each of the dwellings. Unit 1 and 2 are provided with a single garage and tandem car space. Unit 3 is provided with a carport. The form and appearance of the development is a traditional form, hipped roofs, external materials commonly found in the area being timber, brick and render. All entries are visible from the connecting street and are linked by a pedestrian path extends to the footpath edge. Councillors, this application was advertised in the normal fashion, sign on site, notices sent to adjoining owners and occupiers. The proposal has attracted 8 objections and 1 petition, the petition containing 54 signatories. The grounds of objection in summary are the double-storey dwellings are not in keeping with the character of the area, overdevelopment, reduced privacy, increased traffic, increased pressure on street parking, removal of vegetation from the site, restrictive covenant in the area, social issues arising from renters of units, decreasing property values because of multiple dwellings. The proposal will set a precedent for more dwellings in the area. The design is out of keeping with neighbourhood character, environmental impact from the redevelopment, increased noise from the increased density, safety concerns during construction, and increased risk from surface runoff as a result of decreased permeability of the site. Councillors, our assessment of this proposal is that it is supportable. When referring to the table in the agenda, which identifies areas of compliance with the controls, the 2 areas where the development fails relate to street setback, and the other relates to private open space. All other areas, the objectives and the standards are met. So with regard to street setback, it particularly relates to Unit 1 and its setback to Elliott Street. The encroachment in the setback is as a result of the porches that are attached to the dwelling, and because they are at a height beyond what the planning scheme notes, they become the point of setback. Our assessment there, though, is that the setback is appropriate because it does vary between 6 and 8 metres, 8.8 metres to be precise, and that there is context in that the adjoining dwelling to the east has a significant site separation from the subject site. So oblique views of the neighbouring dwelling and impact on the streetscape would not be impacted. So we believe the objective is satisfied even though the standard isn't. With regard to private open space, the shortfall relates to Unit 1. The schedule that applies to the zoning here requires that 55 square metres of private open space be provided, of which 40 square metres is to be secluded private open space either to the side or rear with a minimum dimension of 3.5 metres. The table in the agenda clearly notes that the total private open space for Unit 1 is 188 square metres, so significantly exceeds the 55 square metres. The shortfall relates to the the secluded open space, which is 29 square metres, and the minimum dimension of that space is 3.12 metres. Councillors, we're suggesting that that open space, or the secluded open space for Unit 1, be increased, and that is to be achieved by reducing the floor area of the living space so that the wall of the living room facing the secluded open space runs in alignment with the kitchen external wall so that the open space is increased. The total quantum of open space then is approximately 192 square metres. Councillors, we are recommending that the application be supported with conditions noted in the agenda. I might mention particular conditions. Condition 1A seeks to enlarge that secluded open space I just referred to. Condition 1C seeks to play down some of the architectural detailing to the external walls and associated roof of the ensuites to Unit 2 and 3 to play down their massing. Condition 1D seeks to deal with overlooking from Unit 3, ground floor windows that face neighbouring secluded private open space. In that it requests the provision of an increase in height of boundary fencing to prevent overlooking. Condition 1K seeks to modify external materials, colours and finishes to simplify the material palette colouring used for the development. Thank you, councillors.
Thank you, Mr Wallace. Councillors, we have 2 objectors listed to speak tonight. We have Mr Mario Mitzi and Tammy Clark. You will both have 2.5 minutes to speak. So I'll invite whoever would prefer to come up first to come up. In fact, you can both come up and take a table.
Never done this before, so...
That's okay, we're very relaxed.
Okay.
But we do stick to time. So a clock will come on and if you're happy, we'll give you 2.5 minutes each. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, it's Tammy.
Tammy, yep.
Tammy. Welcome, Tammy, and
Hi.
2.5 minutes, off you go.
Okay, so I'm speaking in objection to the proposal. I have previously lived in areas where the houses have all been split up with unit developments. It causes nothing but problems, and it causes a transient population of renters and people going through the area, and often people who don't care about where they're living. So the blocks and the appearances and the social things that come with it often affect the people who have bought into that area because it's their forever home, you know? And so I've done that. I've deliberately moved out of Footscray, Kingsville, and that's exactly what's been going over there. They've got a high density planning scheme going on over there, and I have deliberately moved to the Gellibrand estate because I knew there was a large percentage of properties covered by covenants. I was going to have neighbours that were well established, living there, caring about their properties. I didn't have to be affected by people parking on my nature strips or in front of my house or my driveway, or, you know, just, I can't tell you what I've been through, but anyway. So, you know, I have deliberately bought into the Gellibrand estate based on the lifestyle that was being presented and offered there, and having units increasingly encroach into that area is saying to me that we are going to move in the direction of Footscray and Kingsville. So I think with, 62 people in total, if you count the 54 on the petition and the other 8, that's 64 people in total. This symbolises a much larger number of people. Am I over my time?
No, just 10 seconds to finish up.
So, I really think that council should support their community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Clark. We'll now hear from Mr Mitzi.
Thank you for having me. Before I go into my main speech about this, I'd just like to refer to the Council's own City of Darwin Amendment C144, Housing and Population Report 2014, and just about the demographics of the Marylands estate, and it says the age distribution of Darwin's population is generally similar to the northern sub-region of metropolitan Melbourne. Darwin also has higher proportions of residents aged 75 and over, and Maryland's part of Reservoir in the northwest of Darwin has the highest proportion of elderly residents. It is an area that has been filled with residents that have been there for 40, 50, 60 years, and I'm one reserve the right for somebody else to come in there and develop their block, or because of a loophole that says it hasn't got a covenant on it. Now, I'll continue to read on. Maryland's estate is predominantly single dwelling covenant affected land mass, and this is why it is a highly sought area. People that live here have the privilege of more than 60 years with truly little change. An assured future with what you see is what you get. Security of knowing state and federal laws support our basic rights of living in a peaceful, harmonious environment without congestion or meaningless change. Knowing that because most properties are affected by a single dwelling covenant, if the house next door was to be replaced, it would be upgraded with a single dwelling that would add value to the area, showing growth, wealth and prosperity. And I'm not only referring to financial value, I am mostly referring to the quality of life. Knowing that the area is being filled with owners that can afford something better rather than something cheaper. If you look at the area, you'll see it is being slowly filled with large, expensive, and in many cases two-storey homes. They add true value to an area. It is a known fact. If you can't afford to purchase
10 seconds.
don't need a large single dwelling property, purchase somewhere else. Please look at the other subdivisions in Darebin that have allowed changes like this.
Thank you, that's time. Just finish your sentence.
Northcote, Thornbury, Preston and other parts of Brisbane. The result is congestion, pollution, and in most cases, a fall in true area value. I'll just go to the last piece if you don't mind. Is that all right?
No, that's actually time. Thank you. You've been very articulate. You may both resume your seat and listen to the debate. Thanks for coming tonight. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Wallace? Councillor Greco.
Through you, Mayor, to the officers, I just wanted to get an understanding of the types of dwellings that are in that area, and linked to that question is also, do we have any estimate of the number of single dwelling covenant covered properties circling that particular property under consideration tonight?
In response to your first question, Councillor, the predominant dwelling stock in this area is single dwelling housing, single or two-storey, predominantly single-storey, but there are double-storey homes in the area. There are some unit developments as well, but predominantly single and two-storey. In terms of how many sites are affected by the covenant, I don't have the answer to that. Certainly this land is not affected by the restriction, and that's the reason why the applicants were able to lodge an application for a medium density development on this site.
Thank you, Mr Wallace. I'd just like to let the objectors know that we're not able to take or hear from you again in terms of our governance local law. Councillors may only direct their questions to the council officers. So I appreciate you might have additional information. I'm sorry, there's no further opportunity for you to share that with the meeting. Sorry, that's the way it works. So, councillors, are there further questions? Councillor Amir.
Sorry, just to get a bit to get some further information elaborating on Councillor Greco's query. So the report says the site is located in General Residential Schedule 1. Can we get some more clarity on the types of developments that are permitted in this context?
The Schedule 1 to the General Residential Zone, Councillor, adds another dimension to the site coverage and the amount of private open space. So in this instance, the site coverage cannot exceed the 50% of the site area, and the private open space is increased from 40 square metres to 55 square metres total quantum, and that extra minimum dimension from 3 to 3.5. In terms of the type of housing stock, it's residential stock. It could be units, it could be the single detached housing, it could be residential buildings, which is a more general term used as well. There is an anticipation that you could still build single and two-storey unit development in a location like this. But, yeah.
Thank you. Councillors, are there further questions? Councillor Greco?
Just a further question through you, Mayor. I just wanted to get a clarification from the officers in terms of what level of consideration has been given to the neighbourhood character in assessing this application, because I think it all revolves around that central issue.
Yep. An essential part of our assessment is to assess the neighbourhood character. So it's brought up in clause 55. It also is brought up in our neighbourhood character study. It is covered by a precinct. So what we look at here is ensuring that you do have setbacks from neighbouring properties, you do have visible entries, you do have external forms that are found in the area. As I mentioned earlier, you've got a traditional roof form, the materials, external materials are found in the area as well. The fenestration of the dwellings, the way the windows are arranged and the doors are arranged on the building needs to be consistent. You don't want to have high front fencing closing off the open space at the front yards, that is, and this doesn't do that. So these are dwellings that are two-storey in nature. The only real difference is that they are multiple dwellings on a site. And the fact that it is a corner site, corner sites are sought after by developers for the obvious reason that you'll have one dwelling facing one street and other dwellings still have a frontage to a street, and that's consistent with the character of an area. All dwellings face a street. I hope that answers your question, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr Wallace. Councillors, any further questions? No? I'll therefore seek a motion. Councillor Greco?
Mayor, I have a motion. If you like, I can read it out. It's different to the motion that's in the report. Hopefully it will come up on the screen at the same time. The motion reads like this. The application for planning permit D 827/2018 be refused. The grounds as follows. The proposal fails to satisfy the objectives of clause 22.04, neighbourhood character, of the Darebin planning scheme and the design objectives of the Darebin neighbourhood character study and precinct guidelines 2007 in terms of materials, setback and visual bulk. Second point is that the proposal does not satisfactorily comply with the standards and objectives of clause 55 of the Darebin planning scheme regarding A, clause 55.02-1, neighbourhood character. The proposal is inappropriate in terms of setback and visual bulk. B, clause 55.02-2, residential policy. The proposal is contrary to the preferred character of the area. C, clause 55.03-1, setbacks, street setbacks. The front setback to Elliott Street does not respect the existing character of the area. And the last point, point D, clause 55.05-4, private open space. The proposal does not provide sufficient secluded private open space to Unit 1. So I move that motion.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I think that'll come up on the screen. There we are. Is there a seconder for that motion? There is no seconder. Okay, Councillor Williams, I'll accept that, but please be faster because once I've called it, it's not seconded and it lapses. So thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Greco.
Yeah, just very quickly, Mayor, look, I think the objectors really summed it up. I mean, this planning application, the main reason and the main grounds of objection, I believe, are the issue of neighbourhood character. That's the fundamental issue that we're dealing with in relation to this particular application. Because if you look at the area, and I'm very familiar with that area, it is an area that has had very little change. And why it's had very little change is that because of the single dwelling covenant, which applies to many of the properties in the Marylands area. I acknowledge and appreciate that this particular property does not have a single dwelling covenant, but the neighbourhood, the surrounding properties, many of them, from my understanding and maps that I've seen in the past, have a single dwelling covenant applicable to their land, which has maintained that unique character of very almost no change for many decades in that particular section of Marylands. And so, because of that, even though here on the face of it we're considering 3 dwellings on a corner block, they're sizable dwellings, I admit that. In any other area, they could be entertained. If we're thinking of areas around Thornbury or Northcote or even Preston where there's been a lot of change, you could consider 3 dwellings on a block, or on a corner block, but because of we're dealing with the Marylands area and because of the particular characteristics of that area, it really does not suit that particular place. If you have a look at the aerial shot, which has been provided to us as part of our papers, you will see that there are hardly any other hardly any other unit developments in that area. And that just gives you a snapshot of within 100, 200 metres of the property that we're considering. The other points that I think need to be raised, that where the application does not meet the standards, and again, these have got to do with neighbourhood character issues, is that, as the motion says, the setbacks do not meet the standard, and the requirements in relation to open space do not meet the standard. They are all things that go towards providing that character and that unique sense of spacious properties on a lot of land in that particular area. So on that basis, I hope that councillors will support the rejection of this application.
That's time. Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Williams.
I'd like to also emphasise that the proposal is inappropriate in terms of the setback and visual bulk. And obviously the preferred character of this particular area. The setback is an issue. It does not respect the existing character of the area as a whole, and particularly of the private open space, which it does not provide sufficient secluded private open space, particularly in Unit 1. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any further speakers? There are none. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is lost. Councillors, is there another motion? Councillor McCarthy.
I'll move the substantive motion in the report, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Amir, thank you. We'll just get that motion up on screen. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. That's the officer recommendation.
Thank you. I think in not supporting the previous motion and instead supporting the officer's recommendation, I think it's really important for councillors and planning committee members here to be clear about what the planning system actually says about this site, what the zoning says about this site, what would happen if this found its way to VCAT, and it may still find its way to VCAT, which is that the zoning for this site is incredibly clear, and the officers made that clear. Whilst large swathes of the local area surrounding the site do have covenants on a number of properties, and I think that was correctly referred to by both the objectors. And it may be referred to that this site has what might be described as a loophole. In the planning system, the zoning is the thing that dictates what can happen, and that is why I think it is disingenuous to make an argument that that neighbourhood character would stand up because it simply wouldn't stand up. It wouldn't stand up in an alternative decision-making environment like VCAT, which is where this would have otherwise ended up. The zoning for this site is clear. The zoning for the site, which is not something which is determined in this chamber by this council, but it is determined in fact by the planning minister and by the planning system, says that this is a site where anyone who owns this site can apply to do a multi-unit development such as been proposed in front of us. However, in saying that, that does not mean that it's anything goes. And so our officers have put forward a number of conditions, and they're quite descriptive and quite prescriptive, that go some distance to either bringing those applications, those applied buildings into compliance, ensuring that they do comply with the planning scheme requirements, and also seeking to minimise any impact on surrounding properties. I think it's disingenuous to say to residents that you can stop development at this site when the zoning says something completely different. And so therefore, I think the best course of action for Planning Committee is actually to support the application, because that is what the zoning says is allowed and is required, and what would be held up at VCAT, but in fact go that extra distance as has been proposed in the officer's recommendation, which is to apply very strong conditions to bring into compliance those areas that may not be compliant. So I'd ask councillors in considering, and planning committee members in considering this recommendation, to think about actually trying to have these strong conditions in place rather than leading residents up the garden path and giving them the impression that you can somehow stop a development at a site which is clearly zoned and clearly allowed for multi-unit development.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir.
Thank you. And I echo the sentiments of Councillor McCarthy. It is very clear that there is strong community opposition to this development. As was mentioned, 62 people, including the 54 signatories for the objection. So while that is very clear, what's also very clear is the role that council is legally must play in this these circumstances, which is assessing the application against the state legislation. And as Councillor McCarthy mentioned, it's not set by us, it's set at a state level, and our role is to, as a council, including the staff, to determine whether or not the application is compliant. And in this case, it's compliant in most areas. There are some areas that are not compliant, which is why there are such extensive conditions. There's many pages 6, 7, 8 pages of conditions, which is quite unusual. Usually we have a few, but as was mentioned, it's very clear that these conditions have been put in to reduce the impact of the site on the local area. Because the reality is, if this was refused, it would be very easily passed at VCAT. Even if there was a case where this did not go ahead, any future developments would likely be very similar, because having 3 double-storey dwellings on a site is consistent with the zoning of this area. I think the other point I wanted to make was around some of the comments about the kinds of people who might live in these kinds of townhouses, and that to point out that it's not everyone in Darebin is in a financial position where they're wealthy enough to be able to afford a freestanding house. I'm sure that's what lots of people would love, to be able to all buy a freestanding house. That's not possible, so we do need places where students and young people and people in low-income jobs can live, and that includes places like here.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I'll just touch on a few points. I think it's really disingenuous for council to suggest that because it's zoned in a particular way and because of state government legislation, that we're automatically then required to grant a permit in regards to this particular property. Council has a role. That's why this application has come before council, in order for council to make an assessment and to exercise judgment in relation to whether this particular planning application, under our planning scheme and under the auspices of the state government planning regulations, whether it's appropriate for that particular site. Otherwise, what's the role of council if we don't play that, if we don't make some sort of determination? So here, where I think that council has failed is that we're not giving enough attention and paying enough stress to the issue of neighbourhood character. We're required to make a judgment on that. We just can't say that the state standards or the state regulations, state rules, tie our hands in relation to neighbourhood character. We have to exercise judgment. We, as a council, are best to know what the neighbourhood character of that particular area is. And given the nature of that area, the neighbourhood character, in my view, and I think in the view of many, is that having a multi-unit development on a corner there is highly inappropriate. And as I pointed out before, when you look at the aerial pictures, there's hardly anything in that area that really would comes close to a three-unit development. So on that basis, I think council should really reconsider their position, because this issue is about neighbourhood character, and council is required to exercise a judgment on that and err on the side of maintaining the character of that particular Merrylands area.
Councillor Greco, thank you. Are there any further speakers? Councillor McCarthy, you have a right of reply.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Greco's opposition to this motion was primarily framed around the premise of neighbourhood character, and I just would draw councillors back to the actual statement that is included in the agenda on page 23, which outlines clearly what the neighbourhood character statement is for the area. I think every councillor in this chamber right now would know that neighbourhood character is by far one of the weakest grounds for refusing an application. We know this because every time we have done it, almost every time it has been thrown out. And hence my point before that it is disingenuous to mount a case primarily on neighbourhood character, which was the basis of Councillor Greco's alternative motion. However, if we go to the neighbourhood character statement, it's quite clear from the neighbourhood character statement that it does not, as I stated before, reinforce the argument that it could somehow override the zoning for the site. It does not do that. What it does do is it provides some guidance, certainly not enforceable, about how any development at this site
Mayor Reddy,
should be
just
thought
a
about.
point of order. I did not say in my statement that neighbourhood character overrides.
Sorry, Councillor Greco, you need to refer to the governance local law in raising a point of order. So
It's
if you
a
could.
statement on misrepresentation. As my point of order is in relation to misrepresentation. I did not state in my contribution that neighbourhood character overrides the zoning laws. I did not state that.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy, would you care to...
Councillor McCarthy, please retract that statement.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor McCarthy, would you care to reframe?
I actually didn't say that Councillor Greco had said that. I said that the primary argument that he made was about neighbourhood character, and then I went on to explain neighbourhood character is not a sound basis for overriding the zoning.
Okay.
So,
I'm going to ask Councillor McCarthy to keep going. Councillor Greco, thank you for raising that concern. I think that you may have inferred that from Councillor McCarthy's words, but that's not exactly what he said. So on that basis, I'll ask Councillor McCarthy to be careful in the way he frames things, but I actually believe that...
Hey, really, just a point of clarification. I did not infer that from his statement. It's what Councillor McCarthy said.
Okay, Councillor Greco, thank you. I understand that that's what you heard. We're not going to replay the tape. I've asked Councillor McCarthy to be mindful that may have been what was heard, and let's move on.
Mayor Reddy, if I may, I'd like to dissent from your call.
Certainly.
To allow Councillor McCarthy to continue whilst he's misrepresented my statements.
Is there a seconder for that?
Second it for the debate.
Thank you. Councillor Greco's motion of dissent in the chair has been seconded.
In any case, there's been a ruling.
is misleading or a false statement. So I think that's what Councillor Greco was alluding to. I'll ask that Councillor Newton come and take the chair.
Councillor Greco will deal with your point of order. So you've got 2 minutes to speak. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Look, my point of order goes to the issue of Councillor McCarthy stating that that I am suggesting or alluding to that the neighbourhood character overrides the zoning rules. I did not state that. What I did state was that council has a responsibility in making an assessment on an application in relation to neighbourhood character. That's what council is asked to do, and to try and state or infer or suggest that
10 seconds.
I'm alluding the residents by stating that we could override the state laws is completely incorrect, and I don't accept
That's
that.
time.
And as a result of that, that's why I asked the mayor, the chair, to seek from Councillor McCarthy a retraction of that statement,
Councillor
because it's
Greco,
false
that's
and
time.
misleading to actually even suggest that. I don't mind if councillors have a different view
That's
in
time,
relation
Councillor
to.
Greco. Sorry,
I
that
don't
was
mind
my-
if councillors have a different
That's
view.
time.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time. I don't mind if.
That's time. Sorry, it was 1 minute.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't mind if councillors have a different view about the position that they take, but councillors need to be honest when they take that position to actually argue the substance of the matter and not try to argue it in the way that
Point of
they
order.
are forced to make a particular decision because their hands are tied. Their hands are not tied.
Councillor Greco, that's time. So sorry, we needed to have that for 1 minute rather than 2, and I apologise about that. Councillor Rennie, you've got 1 minute.
Nothing to say. We've wasted enough time on this.
Okay. So we're dealing with Councillor Greco's point of order. So all those in favour? And against? That motion is lost. Yep, sure. So we're dealing with Councillor Greco's point of order. All those in favour?
In favour of the.
In favour of the point of order? The ruling of dissent? Yep, that the ruling be dissented from. And against? That motion is lost. Councillor Rennie, I'll ask you to resume your seat. Thanks.
Councillor McCarthy, you were speaking. I didn't see the clock at the point when we stopped, but
55
you
seconds.
must have
55 seconds.
take 20 because you were interrupted.
So at 55 seconds, is that right? Yep. I'll restate the point again because I want to make sure that the objectors are really clear about the situation that we find ourselves in here as council. We need to consider this matter based on the grounds that are in front of us. The grounds that are in front of us, and the primary one is the zoning. The point I made earlier is that an argument based on neighbourhood character as the primary
10 seconds.
point is destined to fail in VCAT. So I don't want anyone walking out of this chamber thinking that an argument based on neighbourhood character is likely to succeed when in fact all the evidence is to the contrary.
That's time. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour and against? That motion is carried. We had Councillors McCarthy, Rennie, Newton, Amir voting in favour and Councillor Greco and Williams voting against. The Planning Committee has determined to give notice of its intention to grant a planning permit. Objectors have 21 days in which to appeal. Notice of how to do so will be provided to you. Thank you for your time and coming this evening to speak to us. Councillors, that brings us to the end of the reports. In relation to other business, there is a general planning information of scheduled VCAT applications for noting. That's moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Greco. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Consideration of reports considered confidential. There are none. Councillors, I would like to note, before we finish the meeting, a rather sad passing of Dr. Christopher Baker, who is the chair, or was the chair, of the Inner North Community Foundation and has been so since 2016. We're very sad to learn of his sudden passing, and I convey on behalf of all council our condolences both to his colleagues and to his family, and recognise the outstanding input that he's made to the foundation and therefore to our community. We will pass on formally also our condolences to the Inner North Community Foundation. That brings us to the end of the meeting. So thank you, councillors. We'll take a 10-minute break or so and then we'll start again.
Is it really warm?